Thank you, Susanna, and I'm excited to join you here at Games for Change 2022. Thanks so much for the invitation and for tuning in. So, founded in the same year as Games for Change, my research laboratory, the Tiltfactor Lab, has pursued countless research studies and projects in creating and researching games for change. In this brief retrospective, I'll highlight some of the most significant findings in nearly 2 decades of game research and to help us make pro-social games matter. I'll also share the behind the scenes nuts and bolts, how we've operated, lessons learned over the years, if you're interested in pursuing games research to help us all make better games. So off we go. The question that draws us all together is, can games make the world a better place? Everyone at this conference is interested in this question. Is it possible that we could use games to make a difference in global challenges such as climate change or public health? Can we reduce societal biases or encourage people to intervene in problematic situations like situations of danger, sexual assault prevention, etc.? And the big question after all of those is, how do we know that the games are doing what they intended to do once we make them? Since 2003, my research laboratory, Tiltfactor, has been the home to the creation of play and games that focus on various aspects of social transformation. We're unusual because we make and study games and investigate them for evidence of their outcomes. We ask, do the games do what we think that they're doing? We study the games in randomized control studies and produce and distribute those which have evidence of positive effects, such as changing players' minds, opinions, beliefs for the better. Tilting, emotional or physical tilting, changes the nature of the game. And that's what my team and I have striven to do: change things for the better, shifting attitudes and behaviors, providing proof of concept for conversations, habits, and new ways in which the real world can be altered and improved with games. And we're genre agnostic. Sometimes in different situations, a different format is required. We research and create urban games, board games, digital games, VR, card games, and more. So first I'm going to start with a few of our discoveries, and then talk about how we operate, and finally offer you some lessons learned as I reflect back on our almost 20-year history at this point. One discovery is about the vital importance of introducing players to the games that we create. A student of mine once studied how games are framed as learning toys. This top educational holiday toy, for example, Blockus, is purported to promote spatial reasoning, advertised to, quote, develop strategic skills and logic, plus it's fun to play even for parents. It won a Mensa award. But in her study of over 100 undergraduates playing the game, Cody Theriot found stereotype threat running rampant in the way games are framed for the players. The influence of framing is well known in psych research, and her findings are in line with other framing studies. In this game, women and men had similar scores in spatial reasoning tests before playing in the control condition. But when the game was introduced as a strategic game, that conditions group saw men's scores go up and women's scores go down. When introduced as a spatial game, the effect was exacerbated. How we introduce, talk about, and position our games dramatically impacts player experiences. My research team conducted experimental studies of the full prototype of the board game Monarch at all-male New England boarding schools. One of the studies varied the timing of the revelation of the character's gender within this all-male youth sample. The game positions players as playing as daughters of the queen. The players in the fictional world play as sisters. One could say princesses, though we didn't use that term in the study. And in a pair of randomized experiments involving Monarch, research revealed that a positive impact of delaying the timing of the revelation of the character's gender and reducing the degree of stereotypical femininity of the illustrated representation of the characters had an impact on boys' evaluation of the game, their level of experience taking or identification and role assumption. And with the princess characters, there was a shift in both gender perceptions and self-perceptions after playing the game. The findings illustrate that strategic design choices can facilitate boys' adoption of cross-gender personae and open the door to malleability in adherence to or judgment about rigid gender roles and social norms. This study was important for several reasons. It demonstrated that a little ambiguity for players goes a long way in helping them identify with and connect with new play experiences and perspectives. So off to another discovery. Games can encourage people to intervene, such as in preventing sexual assault. We worked with the University of New Hampshire Prevention Innovations Group to develop a college freshman intro program using 2 games, Mindflock, a same room multi-device mobile trivia game, and an interactive space comic, Ship Happens, which explored bystander intervention in a space-related spring break phenomenon. So we used both fantastical fiction and a party game format to get around what's called psychological resistance or psychological reactance, resistance to being told what to think or do. Fiction and the party game format helped open up the space for players to do their own interpreting. Our study on the 2 games for bystander intervention consisted of a 4-week study that included over 250 participants. Both games were aimed at first male college year students. And we have a lot of charts and graphs here, and the papers, of course, I've tried to list the papers in this talk so you can look things up later. But the pretest was administered, and after playing the game, we revisited the students a month later. The bystander efficacy measures went up on a 10-point scale among the male students in the study in a statistically significant way. Bystander efficacy measures participants' beliefs about how comfortable they are if they were asked to intervene, understanding and reflecting on their own ability to change challenging situations. Additionally, we've measured bystander attitudes, which measures participants' improving attitudes towards intervening. A month may not feel like a long time in a study of a game, but in fact, long-term studies that measure a lot of impact over time are quite rare, and especially in game studies, an underrepresented field of study in terms of social science data. We have a long way to go to get longitudinal studies up and running. They're notoriously difficult to fund. But it is interesting that we were able to see these really positive results. And it just gives us hope for the future as we create these proof of concepts to have everybody else learn from them and take them forward. Here's another discovery. Games can shift prejudices. We may think phenomenon like gender bias, racism, or unchangeable social phenomenon. But a study by Laurie Rudman, Richard Ashmore, and Melvin Gary in 2001 showed that students who had enrolled in a prejudice and conflict seminar showed significant reductions in their levels of prejudice, both conscious and unconscious, compared to a similar group of students who took a research methods course. So this study is kind of a great base for us to remind us that our biases are malleable, and learning about them can give players self-insight and motivation to be on a journey of change. So pro-social games often utilize direct, explicit approaches to engage players with serious real-life scenarios or present information about key societal issues. But this approach can limit how persuasive a game can really be, particularly when the apparent aims of the game trigger players' psychological defenses or reduce players' potential engagement with or enjoyment of the game experience. So in contrast, we've developed this approach called embedded design that offers evidence-based strategies for more integrated ways of delivering persuasive content in a game in a fashion that circumvents players' psychological defenses and triggers a more receptive mindset. A more recent study here is testing the effect of an aha moment in a virtual environment. We tested whether embodying a woman in science and virtual reality leads to more positive attitudes towards women in science, technology, engineering, and math, or what's called STEM. So undergraduate men played a physicist in a VR game in which they were randomly assigned to play a man or a woman avatar, who they saw earlier or later in the game. So compared to participants in the man science condition, participants in the woman science condition felt more positively about women and viewed the category of women as more overlapping with the category of science. However, they viewed their own scientist character more negatively. So there were no effects of the game condition on implicit biases, perception of the climate for women in STEM, or game enjoyment. But this study suggests that VR interventions may decrease some negative attitudes towards women in STEM, but are not a panacea for the pervasive biases against women in STEM. So picking out the details about what is working and what's not remains a key aspect of how we need to move forward in Games for Change. This is a comic study that we pursued just before the pandemic, and it's pretty interesting because it's not necessarily a game, but there are things here we can learn from. Because in this study, brief messages, we are exploring whether brief messages on social media would have the potential to raise awareness about gender biases in science, tech, engineering, and math by reducing defensive reactions. And in a study with 436 college students, we examined reading tweets with comics versus text-only tweets about gender biases in STEM. So women, but not men, felt less defensive regarding their views about women in STEM after viewing the posts. And women in the comic condition thought that there were more women in STEM than there really are. Men's perceptions did not change in either condition. Thus, the results provide preliminary evidence that comics about women in STEM may be effective at changing women's perception about women in STEM. And text-only tweets were equally effective as the comics for decreasing women's defensiveness and altering views about the climate for women in STEM. So I always like to come back to some foundational research in this area. Harvard social psychology professor and leading bias researcher, Mazarin Banaji, has conducted about 25 years of findings, studies and findings, and she's really up on the findings of others. She wrote the bestseller Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People. And biases are not something people readily admit that they want to change or they even can identify. We know that stereotypes limit who we can trust, who we work with, and how to be effective leaders. It also causes lots of societal strife. So how can we forge a more inclusive point of view and help everyone avoid stereotypes? That's a big question for us. Finally, one last study here. I'm gonna move on to infrastructure. We were working with climate scientists to increase sustainability behaviors, and we decided to hack a popular game with subtle content and study real-world recycling behaviors. So this may be a familiar-looking game. We developed two versions of Cops Arrest Manatees. The climate change version that included some cards with climate change themes and a Russia style. For example, it talks about sad polar bears, and it's very, very, very sad, but this keeping up with the same kind of dark humor. In the climate change condition, a third of the white cards were climate related, and in the neutral condition, none of the white cards were climate related. So in a field-based experiment with nearly 160 adults who played a version of one of two of those games, we monitored recycling and donation behaviors. And players were given party-style plastic cups from which to drink water as part of entering the study area, but each cup was secretly labeled with invisible ink so that we could track players' recycling behaviors as different groups played different versions of the game with or without the climate content. At the end of the study, we went through the trash and the recycling to find out who recycled. The bad news is that only 10%, and I have some data, there's a hidden number there. The bad news is that only 10% in the control condition of people who did not have climate-related material recycled, which is an abysmal number. The good news is that folks in the climate condition recycled significantly more, but it was still only 30%. So this kind of study can show us how we can start to nudge behaviors all around us with different kinds of ways of approaching climate and playful methods even in everyday life. All right, so how we frame play, how games encourage intervention, how games can shift prejudices, and improving sustainability behaviors. I've been amazed at what we've been able to create and discover in the last 2 decades. I'm really excited about that. Really quickly, how we operate, we We have a lot of interesting infrastructure things to share. Some of you may be really familiar with this stuff, but for example, we get funded from research grants. Oops, want to go back. So large-scale multi-year research grants are hard won, but they're the best way to build up your infrastructure. So my lab has been funded by a lot of organizations, most recently been working with the National Academy of Sciences. But we have found that when we have a large research grant, like a multi-year research grant with a big team, like such as a National Science Foundation grant versus a small commission, a good multi-year research project in the sciences or health can run from $200,000 to $4 million and can really build up the capacity for your team to be able to be solid and have a whole ongoing set of staff and opportunities for those staff. So large sources of funding help you be more sustainable as an organization. Creation grants and commissions are excellent and often rewarding partnerships, but they rely on you to kind of have an existing team and infrastructure already. And often these don't have any funding for postdocs or other experts that you can involve to carry out rigorous research and experimentation. So while they're often great projects, they're more difficult to have as a sustained research lab structure. Of course, it helps to be at an institution that offers seed funding, pilot innovation funding, or other types of research offerings, or helps you get an endowment. Those would be pie in the sky ideas for funding your work. Seed funding is great because sometimes you need evidence to move forward, and seed funding can serve as proof of concept in a larger project. And finally, you might just take on partnerships as small side projects and consult or even work voluntarily on causes you care about. And that might help build a portfolio of projects that later on could be a larger fundable body. So all of these ways of supporting what you're trying to do really matter in this particular space. So lessons learned. It's been nearly 20 years. So what have we learned besides our research discoveries? One of the key things I'd like to emphasize is that collaborating with social scientists, particularly social psychologists, is a rich direction for games research. Social scientists are trained to design experiments. They're experts in data collection and measurement, human subjects research, vital skills when aiming for research that contributes to what we know about games for change. And I've been lucky enough to work with a wonderful group of people, researchers outside my field, and make excellent complementary partners and build these interdisciplinary research teams to be strong. So find people whose work inspires you, people have skills unlike your own. Most of my collaborators have not been game designers, but social scientists, sometimes communication researchers, women and gender studies folks, and even a philosopher. So thank you all. And if you can fund them, inviting postdoctoral researchers to be part of a team is a wonderful way to launch research careers and share the work of a complex lab. Our internal team at Tiltfactor has involved, over the years, probably 150 to 200 undergraduate students. I work at Dartmouth College, where we don't have graduate students very often in arts and humanities. So most of the students that I've worked with have been undergraduate students. And then I have a core staff for the last decade: Max Seidman, a former student; Suki Panjestical, also a former student, strangely; Danielle Taylor, and they've served as the anchor around rotating students, rotating researchers, postdocs, etc. So I'm just giving a big shout out to them, as well as recommending that this kind of approach to building your team is a helpful way to think about this stuff. We like to pay attention to assumptions that fail. And this is not something we talk about a lot in the Games for Change community. We want to show our projects and how well they work, right? Games that fail can help you learn as much as a game that is successful, and possibly more. It may be very difficult if you're aiming to make a product that goes out into the world, right? But if you are really contributing to the research idea, understanding how the games have failed and why is a compelling thing to do. So one of the key lessons I've learned is that our best intentions that look effective, that start dialogue, that meet with critical success, often don't work, or they can unintentionally backfire and even cause harm. So, like for example, emotions, they're challenging to measure and they often don't appear as they are if measured in another way. So appearances, observing players, these kinds of things can only take us so far. We really need lots of ways into understanding a player experience through research. And that's something that we have really developed over the years. It's not something I started with, but it's something I had to develop, especially when moving into areas of health and when you're doing human subjects research. Participants need to be involved in a very, very responsible and sustainable and healthy way. And so really understanding what their experience is going to be is vital. And a little bit on this, we have a failed games paper about this actually. So about 30%, I'd say, of the games we develop to an advanced prototype do not show measurable evidence in our preliminary studies. We think the game, okay, let's see if this game will do X, Y, or Z, and sometimes it just doesn't. And it's a good percentage of the kind of things that we pursue. It's important that we not just try to force the games to do something they're not designed to do, but we just take a step back, we throw out the prototype, we have many ideas, so why not go to a second idea? So getting wed to an idea in one's head and trying to force that through rather than listening to what the information that you're getting might reveal is important. And this is true for this game on the screen right now. This was called Skyline. We had a game that it was about spatial reasoning, and it was trying to improve spatial reasoning in underrepresented populations, particularly women, and actually it actually caused anxiety and did not improve anyone's spatial reasoning. Oops. So we found out through advanced prototypes that this wasn't maybe a direction to pursue, and left the game and didn't end up pursuing that game, even though it as an experience, it was a fun experience for our team and for some of the players. It wasn't doing the kind of work that we wanted it to do. So a final note is to stick to your team's values. Make sure that the games you're making meet your core values and the project values, or don't do it. I can't tell you how many times I've been approached by various organizations who want to do a game that does good, but the way that they're proposing to do it, actually, I don't think would be a good idea. And I have turned down those proposals, and I've turned down those opportunities, even though it meant turning down funding, turning down the opportunity to work with large organizations. Sometimes the misplaced ideas are not positive. So I would just urge everyone to reflect on your team's core values, make sure your prototypes and your games are reflecting them from the whole design process. And 2 years out, 3 years out, look back at them and say, oh, has the stuff we've been making, has it really made the difference that we wanted to? Has it really reflected our values? So that is one of my big recommendations from a lesson learned standpoint. And finally, if you're getting valid data from your game, and this is going to be a hard one for you designers out there, trust the data over your design instinct. This is really interesting for me because I have many, many years of being a designer commercially and academically. And I sometimes am surprised that the data doesn't reflect what I perceive to be observing as an experienced designer. My notes about players and the player interaction and where players run into challenges and questions may not actually match what players are reporting through different kind of psychological measures. So it's important to be vulnerable in a way, and to realize that what you might be observing is only one part of a larger story, and that this social science data can really help us reveal new aspects of the kinds of directions we're trying to pursue. So I've said a lot of things in the last 25 minutes, and I want to just end with a word of thanks for this community, because I founded Tiltfactor the same year that that Games for Change was founded. I feel like in some ways we've grown up together, and the connections and the people part of the Games for Change community have been really our lifeline about there is a group of people asking these questions. We aren't like the sole actors. We do have an urge from game developers to social activists to nonprofit organizations to try to playfully transform the culture in which we live, and to use play in a positive way. And so with that, I want to thank this community at large for being there while we have been struggling to find things out and publish our papers and make our games and distribute things. It's been a long journey, and but a really rewarding one, in part thanks to this community who really gets it, that there's this is a valuable space for everybody. So I want to thank you for your time today, and thanks to all the people who have contributed to this work over the years. And I hope you enjoy this year's amazing Games for Change